All right, the clerk will read and record the verdict.
In the Superior Court of the State of Arizona, in and for the County of Maricopa, State of Arizona versus Lori Daybell, CR 2022-00-1242-001. Verdict, count 1. We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action upon our oaths, do find the defendant, Lori Daybell, as to the crime of count 1, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder occurring on or about October 2nd, 2019, as follows. Guilty. Signed, foreperson. Are these your true verdicts, so say you one and all?
Yes.
Yes.
It took that jury of 12 less than an hour to reach that verdict. You heard it, guilty. Erica, you were inside the courtroom today. What was that reaction to that verdict as it was read?
You know, you saw it there. Lori Vallow Daybell just sat leaning back in her chair, slumping down, and she appeared to not have any reaction whatsoever. And it makes you wonder, did she know that this was coming? And I think it was the same vibes the last time she got convicted and the time before that, because Andrea, this is her third criminal case in less than 3 years. She's already been convicted in Idaho for killing her children, Tylee and JJ, as well as her role in the death of her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. And then back in April, she was convicted in Arizona for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. All of the victims in those 2 other cases are dead. But in this case, the third criminal case here in Arizona, she was just found guilty this morning of conspiring to kill Brandon Boudreaux, her niece's ex-husband. And what's interesting about this case, Andrea, is that Brandon did not die. He was shot at by Alex Cox. That's what the prosecution put forward here, with help from Lori Vallow Daybell. And he was able to take the stand in this case and sit in the courtroom today with his family and supporters, listening in to hear that guilty verdict. So it was truly remarkable to get to this point. And as you noted, Andrea, it came really quickly. We believe it was roughly about a half an hour that the jury was deliberating total.
Yeah. So they had just a few minutes. We know that the decision went to them last night, but we know they were only together for a few minutes. We can't know exactly what they said or what was discussed in those few minutes. Came back this morning, and within a very short time, as you said, less than half an hour later, we got word that that verdict was in. So, we talked yesterday on the show, we talked about how some analysts who've looked at this case did say, they don't say it very often, but this one felt like a slam dunk. And it seems like with the speed that the jurors came back with this verdict, with it seems like that's exactly what it was. Seems like it was, very little discussion must have been had. Seems like they had their decision made very, very quickly. And so that does speak to the way that we talked about how the prosecution laid this case out. I mean, it was very, very straightforward. Not a lot of, questions about the evidence, very, very straightforward, again, black and white evidence. And so it seems that the jury agreed with what we said, that, there was really no answer or no defense that Lori presented. Of course, she didn't present any evidence in her defense, but of course tried to poke holes as those witnesses took the stand, tried to ask those questions to kind of raise doubt about the information they were sharing. But it doesn't seem that landed well with the jurors at all.
No, and it was interesting because, Andrea, we weren't just looking at Lori Vallow Daybell when this was being read. Leading up to this, Trina Kay, the prosecutor in not just this case, but Lori Vallow Daybell's first Arizona murder conspiracy trial here in Arizona. As I said, she's been the prosecutor for both, and she came into the courtroom and, was talking with some of the victims advocates, and, had a smile on her face before this verdict was read. So I think she knew. I think that quick return must be a signal, of course, for everyone in the room that that's the way this was going. And, the case agent on this was a case out of Gilbert, Arizona. The detective on the case was also there. I saw him give Trina Kay a hug after this was over. I caught him outside the courthouse very briefly. He said he was, typically the police department has not commented on this case, but he said he was happy with the way it went today. So I think this was just, as you said, a slam dunk win all around. But he was not the only one we caught up with outside the courthouse. We were able to actually hear from Brandon Boudreaux, who, as you know, Andrea, has really kind of stayed on the sidelines, I think intentionally because he knew this case was going to trial. But this was really the first time we got to hear him speak out amid everything that has happened over the past 5+ years. So take a listen.
For my,
You're all right. I prepared just a short statement that I wanted to share. Kay had something she wanted to share, and I want you guys to know that we stand united.
I got it.
We're still family. We always will be, regardless of the things that happened. But go ahead, Kay. Share your thought.
Okay.
And then I'll share mine.
We got it. Okay, for my brother Jerry, we got the bitch again. That's for you, Jerry.
My statement is as follows. 2,078 days. I'm humbled. I can't even imagine how many hours have been spent by law enforcement and prosecutors tirelessly working to uncover the truth. The truth is that hatred, selfishness, and greed almost led to the end of my life. 12 strangers verified that Lori must be held accountable. I have heard the question asked, why hold this trial? She already has multiple life sentences. My response is simple. We owe it to those who are victimized and choose to follow the law to uphold justice on their behalf. So many victims never get this day. So I thank the judge and the jury who willingly put their lives on hold to complete this process. I did not enjoy sitting and giving someone who tried to kill me the chance to question me, but I owed it to Charles, to Tylee, to JJ, and to Tammy to speak because I could. I don't know the statistics of how many people never get the chance because they were killed or because we can't find the people who committed the crime. But we as a society owe it to them to move forward with prosecuting those who commit violent crimes. I've chosen in my life to be and live as a man who believes in Jesus Christ and in God. So I view my life from this lens. I heard this in this trial about loving everyone. I support this cause. However, I do not believe that all the things that were said follow that. The Savior did say, "Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." The beautiful part of this human experience is, as Isaiah said, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes. When we trust the Lord to do this with our lives, He can do wonders with us. I'd like to share two things that I have used in my life to help me move forward and create beauty from the ashes. The first is from Viktor Frankl. He taught there's a space in life between stimulus and response where we can choose and have freedom. It is okay to feel hatred, anger, passion, and a myriad of other feelings when life's stimulus are unexpected or unfair or both. But true freedom comes from mastering our ability to respond in our actions, independent of the stimulus, to choose who we will be and to act and not to be acted upon. Secondly, I believe every human being is a child of God and has immeasurable worth. Hating a person can be like a poison to our souls. It can take away our joy and our happiness. I believe we can have enmity towards someone's actions or choices while still forgiving them for our own selves, to have more room for love and happiness and joy. Truly living this principle is a process. It takes time. But as we apply these two principles, that of choice before response, and forgiveness and love and valuing others as oneself, I believe that it makes our society better. So thank you for coming and supporting me in this, for all of you who have. And we're grateful today for those who let us have our due process. So
Brandon, would you
Thank
say
you.
you've forgiven Lori?
It's a process. I will do my best. It's something that I believe if you give away your hatred to the Savior, I would tell you that there is more room for joy and love for your family, for your friends, for those who do love you. So that's the best I can share. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but I appreciate the question.
What did you think that the jury came back less than 30 minutes?
I'm grateful that they did their responsibility, and I'm grateful for a verdict.
Brandon, where do you go from here?
I'll continue moving forward with my life. I have a beautiful wife. I have wonderful family. I have so much wonderful family that's waiting back there. I'll go back to anonymity, hopefully, and just live my life and be another person who tries to do the right thing in the right situation. And I want to say thank you to all the people who did the right thing, who came in, who gave up their time and participated in the process. There's a lot of people who don't get any thank yous that give up their time, and so I just want them to know I'm grateful.
Jenny, anything else?
I am grateful that I am standing next to this man right now.
Thank you,
Grateful
guys.
that he's here.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day.
Well, what a turn there. I mean, watching him come out of the steps, off the steps of that courthouse, that smile, a smile we have not seen. He was, very serious during his testimony, as is expected. He took it very seriously, was very intentional and deliberate with all of those actions. But that smile, that relief, that connection that he and Kay Woodcock there, that is the sister of Charles Vallow, as we've talked about many times. She's been in that courtroom. And has certainly shared sentiments about Lori. She did testify in her last trial. Of course, she was also part of the case against Lori Vallow Daybell here in Idaho. But to see them together, and of course, Brandon mentioned that they've often talked about they are now connected, and he said we are going to stay connected despite this. But then to see that turn, get very emotional in his response. But he reminds us. And I think it's easy in these moments I'm sure, to have some elation and to some relief when that verdict is read, but then how quickly you go back to all of those people who aren't able to see justice served. The people
Absolutely.
that, of course, we know are dead at the hands of Lori Vallow Daybell, Chad Daybell, and Alex Cox. So as that reminder, they're very somber.
Yeah, and Andrea, I know maybe some of the reporter questions there were a little tough to hear, but I think there's a lot we can unpack from Brandon's remarks, especially because he's one of the people we don't get to hear about very often. And what stood out to me was exactly what you just pointed out, is how every time, there's been a conviction in Lori's prior cases, or even Chad Daybell's case, who he's on death row in Idaho, sentenced to death there for his role in the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. He is believed to be a co-conspirator in this case here, trying to kill Brandon Boudreaux, but the prosecutor or the county attorney's office here in Arizona ultimately decided not to go forward with charges for him. So that's where that stands at this point in time. But yeah, he being Brandon Boudreaux, every time there was a conviction in another case, he always brought it back to the victims. And we saw him doing that again today, and choking up almost, because I would imagine you must feel a certain kind of way when you are the only living victim who can take the stand and talk about this in this kind of way. And out of frame, Andrea, I know our camera angles, it's tough to show a lot of different things when we're playing just the sound out here, but Colby Ryan was standing next to him as well. That's Lori Vallow Daybell's adult son. He, has sat in on her two of her trials here in Arizona. We know he's testified in, at various points in Idaho. And he described, I go back, I believe it was the sentencing of Chad Daybell back in 2024, where he said, I'm sisterless, brotherless, fatherless, and motherless, because Charles Vallow, Lori's former husband, was a father figure to him. His younger siblings, Tylee and JJ, found dead in Chad Daybell's backyard. And motherless because his mom, Lori Vallow, is sentenced to life in prison in Idaho, and now she just keeps going through these criminal cases here. So he did not say anything today, but I think it speaks volumes to have him come out and stand next to Brandon when he, doesn't have to keep coming to court. But I think, as you said, these people are really bonded by something that, was so horrible and so heinous. But, there is some sort of power in being able to see these convictions. And I'll point out to Andrea that
Sure.
Brandon addressed a question that we get all the time. And there's a lot more I want to get to with his statements, but
Right.
why even go forward with this trial? I think he said
Yes.
it so perfectly, because it does
Yeah.
matter. It does matter to get a conviction in each and every case because there are different victims here.
Right. Yeah, and he said that, right? He talked about that idea of having, that justice, and that, it is, and there's some respect to be paid, or, some sort of validity to be said that this matters. And I think that is what we've heard from the prosecution. Of course, the prosecutor Trina Kay saying that this does matter, right? It matters for Brandon. It matters for Brandon's family. It matters, I think, for Kay Woodcock. I think it matters for Colby Ryan. And so it is interesting because you were able to see, I guess, put a face to exactly what she's talking about. And it does, and that's clear in Brandon Boudreaux's statement. As much as he did not want to go through this, he talks about going back into anonymity. I don't think that he ever asked to be a part of this or to be out in public view in a way like this. And yet, it seems to me that he very much appreciates, as he said, the opportunity to see justice in this case. And I'm sure it may go also to his healing that he spoke to, right? He talks about kind of being able to process some of this and take time to work through it. But this is probably a big step forward for that.
Yeah. And again, Andrea, it was a bit tough to hear, but one of the reporter questions was, have you forgiven Lori?
Right.
A lot of his remarks had, religious meaning to him. And you can tell that he's a religious person. And
Sure.
that strikes me because we know that in these other cases where Lori Vallow Daybell has been convicted, the prosecution has said that she essentially weaponizes religion, that she and Chad Daybell and Alex and the others who were, connected to them were were twisting religion to justify killing people. And I think it just shows, kind of the dark side of things, but then how faith can actually be helpful here. And to answer that question of, do you forgive her? Because he talked about forgiveness a little bit in his remarks. One of the reporters asked, do you forgive Lori? And he just said, it's a process.
Right. And instead also said too, is that, he is, his belief is that kind of that idea of, if I hold on to the hate and I hold on to the anger and the resentment, then I don't have space for love and space for that, that joy. And so standing there next to him, of course, is his wife now. We know that he was married to Melanie Boudreaux at the time of the shooting. They divorced soon after that. He is now remarried. And to have her also be able to say, how fortunate she is that this, we heard testimony where it talked about being this shot that was fired, being just inches from Brandon's head, potentially very, very close to ending his life. And just how fortunate she feels to be able to be standing next to him. And again, to see that smile back on his face and, the relief in that also speaks volumes, I think.
Yeah. And you mentioned Melanie. Melanie Pulowski is her name now. She was Melanie Boudreaux.
Yes.
And again, hard to hear in some of those remarks, but another reporter asked, do you think Melanie should be charged? Because we heard in open court during this trial that Melanie is considered a co-conspirator in this case. And she's not faced any charges at this point in time. I did ask our county attorney's office today, are they planning to, charge her? And what they told me is that they have not received any submittals. So here in Arizona, and like many other places, I'm sure it's up to the police agencies to submit a case to the county attorney's office. Then they decide whether or not they're going to bring charges forward. So that remains to be seen, because we also learned in open court that Melanie is part of an open investigation. Again, this according to the prosecutor.
Sure.
So I did reach out to the Gilbert Police Department. They've told me that they were not able to comment on this trial. So I haven't gotten an answer yet, but I would definitely want to know if there is something coming up the pipeline for her. And as you heard Brandon say, when he was asked about this, he said, I'm not going to talk about that right now. So obviously we have to respect that answer. And who knows, maybe there's nothing that comes. So that's a possibility. And I'll point out too, Andrea, that I spoke with her attorney yesterday via email, and he said no comment on this trial. So that's where things stand right now. But, it's been a long time coming for Brandon. It was October 2019 when he was shot at, and it's been more than 5 years. So like you said, that smile, I think it's probably been such a long time coming.
Yes, exactly. Well, and and I want to let's go back to a little bit about the charges and that what that statement was in court about potential, that open investigation into Melanie Boudreau. And we have talked many times because that is one of the biggest questions that folks have about this is, because it doesn't seem to be a secret, just as Alex Cox was always, he is no longer living, so he is not able to face charges, but there's really never been a question about his involvement in any of these cases. And so in this trial, it was very clear, and as you said, Trina Kay made it very clear that Melanie Boudreau is considered a co-conspirator. In her mind, that is what happened. And so when she says open
Clearest
investigation,
we've ever heard that.
Absolutely, exactly. And it makes me wonder if when she said it's an open investigation, yes, does that mean there's actually a piece of paper sitting there, a report waiting to be potentially filed with the prosecutor's office? Or is she saying, kind of in that blanket statement of, watch this, the defendant cannot and should not bring this up because there is no, definitive kind of definitive evidence or definitive record that is able to be used in court, if that makes sense. Yes, she has been looked at and we've talked to her, but there's nothing that we would be able to question on or submit as evidence. Therefore, it's not able to be brought up in court. And so it will be interesting to watch and see, do we hear anything, or is this the end of the Lori Vallow Daybell or the Vallow Daybell Boudreau, / Alex Cox / Chad Daybell? Is this the end? I guess we have to wait and see.
Exactly. That's a great question. And I will say, sitting through this trial, Andrea, Melanie's name came up a lot. She was part of the evidence that was presented. And to your point, we don't know how far that goes. Right. We don't know if it can go anywhere. But this, again, was the clearest picture I saw that includes her in this. So it's, again, she is not charged. We'll be very, very clear about that. Her attorney has said no comment, but it is really interesting. And that obviously is a question on top of everybody's minds. But you know who else I think might have been wondering about Melanie is the jury in this case. And, I know we talked about the speed at which they reached a verdict, but what did you make of that, Andrea? We have to think that, first of all, we said the speed, of course, very, very quickly. But you have to wonder, and I wish we'd had the opportunity to talk to jurors the way that we did in the last trial. And of course, that is my own, my own curiosity, my own wanting to get inside their heads and ask them about their experience. That's just the journalist coming out, right? I understand their desire to protect jurors and to not put them in a position of having to talk to media or being forced into a position of talking to media. And we'll talk kind of a little bit about how that worked. Of course, different than the last trial. But I'm happy to tell you exactly what happened. Yeah, well, go ahead. Let's just talk about that right now, because we did get to hear from jurors last time. So what happened this time? Yeah, so it was interesting because we, sitting in there, heard the verdict. There was some back and forth that we'll get into regarding the sentencing and whatnot. But the jury was released, and we went to leave the courtroom when they were in recess, and we were stopped by security, we being members of the media and the members of the public. So they let out the case agent, they let out the interns that were in the room, but the rest of us were waiting, essentially, to get out. And then, of course, the victim and the victim's family, they go out through a different door. They are kept in not kept, I shouldn't say kept, but they are able to go, they don't have to go through the main door that we go through. So we were waiting for at least a few minutes, and we're kind of like, okay, we're waiting to get out there. We want to go outside. Most of us have, media partners who are outside waiting. So we're, telling them we're on our way down, getting there. And, we were told by the court public information officer after those few minutes that the jury would not be talking. And we said, okay, well, where are they? And they just kept advising us that the jury will not be talking. And then eventually security got out of stopped blocking the door. They let us out and we went outside, and the jury was nowhere to be seen. So typically this is a big court complex to lay lay the scene for everybody. There are essentially two big court towers in downtown Phoenix. There's, half the time there's Diamondbacks games going on, so parking is terrible, but it's a big complex, and there are a lot of doors, of course, some emergency exits. But it's, basically there's these towers that connect, and there is a main door though. And every day after this trial, we've seen the jury come out the main front doors that we use,
Right.
and then they go to a bus that will take them to where they can park their cars. So when we got out today, we did not see the bus, we did not see any jurors, and then some of the reporters, we kind of fanned out around the buildings, and one looked one way, one looked the other. We could not find them anywhere. So we, believe that that was on purpose, that we were kept in order to avoid, contacting these jurors, even though, and of course it's their right to decide whether or not they want to talk about this. But once they are released from the case, they have the right to do so. And you're right, Andrea, that it's starkly different than what happened last time, which is the jury came out and we essentially, unleashed on them. I know I don't want to sound, put media in the bad light, but we kind of ran after them and said, what do you think? What do you make of this? And I would have to imagine that played a role in it, because we saw a filing from Lori Vallow Daybell about her last trial saying a juror spoke this way and believed this. It didn't go anywhere, but I would imagine they were trying to avoid that. So what do you make of this ordeal? Because it was the first time I've ever been in a situation like that where we weren't able to leave and try and talk to people.
Right. And as somebody who has worked on the other side, if you will, I've worked in public information representing an agency and been involved in these kind of hearings and these kind of processes. And so I would guess that likely, had a juror said, I really would like to talk to media, or I would be open to talking to media, I don't imagine that they would have stopped that from happening. What it sounds like is that the jurors decided they did not, or nobody, was adamant that they wanted to go and talk to media. And perhaps we will still hear from them. We know that they may find a different route to share information. They can speak on behalf, of course, thanks to social media. People can talk, to whomever they want and can speak on their own behalf if they choose to post things and things like that. But I'm guessing also that potentially there was, perhaps the court even saying it would be best if you didn't talk right now because of exactly that, because of that motion filed by Lori Vallow Daybell. Not to say that they wouldn't allow them to, but maybe just if you don't do that today, or let's be cautious about what you might say, because what we heard from her and in that filing was, taking what the jurors said after the trial and sort of making some assumptions about what that meant for what happened during the trial. And as you said, that didn't go anywhere. A judge did not agree that was, jury tampering or any sort of misconduct by a juror. But it does muddy the waters, of course. And that's, as journalists, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to simply, document and share someone's experience. And so, but I would imagine that definitely played a role in their handling of it today.
Absolutely. And, and I want to point out, too, that as much as we want to speak to these members of this particular jury, I know no one ever has to talk to us. So I want to be very clear that we're not just a bunch of vultures wanting to, pounce on everybody. But obviously, that's a big question in all of this, because these people just spent, the past 5.5-ish days, because we had 5 days of, testimony closings. And then this is the 6th day here. So they had, this time they did not have a background of this case, or at least that's what they said. That's why they were selected to be jurors on this case. So the big question is, what do you think now that you have a chance to Google Lori Vallow? And it would be, I think it would be insightful to hear from them, of course, and then especially to hear how they arrived at this verdict so quickly, and what was the biggest pieces of evidence, or what were the biggest pieces of evidence, you know, that sort of thing. But we did get some insights today. I saw at least 2 jurors from Lori's first trial in Arizona who were in the courtroom today. One of them, Tosh Reed Tucker. We have talked about them before. They've even joined in on a few of the days during trial, taking off from work, making sure they could be there in the courtroom. And it was interesting talking to them beforehand. As we were waiting earlier, Tosh said, the closing argument that Lori gave yesterday, I've heard it before, because it was very similar to the one she gave in Charles Vallow's death, and the trial for that. And we should say, Andrea, I know for those who have been following us, they know this, but Lori represented herself in both of her Arizona trials. And that was one of my colleagues today described that as a spectacle. And I would agree with that statement. But it was just interesting to see her demeanor. So I think I would want to pick the brains of the jurors just on how her demeanor played into this too. And, we'll hear from Tosh in just a moment, but I want to hear from you, Andrea, on what you make of all of that.
Well, and I said that yesterday. That was one of my questions yesterday about Tosh, saying if you're listening to this a second time, how different that is, because you hear it for the first time and now you take it into a completely different context. It's similar to, seeing someone present something and you think that they're talking off the cuff, or you think that they're just sharing something, kind of ad-libbing or speaking, just as they're coming to them as it's coming to them, and then you see them do the exact same thing, right? Repeat the exact same words in a different context or a different setting, and you realize it's rehearsed or it's practiced, and it's very different now that you've seen it a second time. And that's what I had to think. If I saw that the first time and then I heard you say the exact same things, and again, even using some of the very same words in your closing about a different
Tragedy.
case and a different scenario, exactly. I think that would be that would sit very differently for me the second time, having sat through it and seen all of the information, again, knowing what I know in hindsight. And so I would also think that demeanor, again, just as it played, likely, as Tosh has said, played into their verdict in the last trial, I would think that also has to have affected jurors today, the ones who made the decision today. Because, even if with all those objections and the tears and the crying, it took them just 30 minutes to make their decision, which tells me that they believed, right? They went into that jury room believing that she was guilty. And so I can't imagine if I believe that to be true, and then I'm watching you, present this information, I think that would feel very contrived. I think it would feel, very forced. And so that would be more difficult for me to hear. And I think it would probably, even just solidify more my opinion.
Yeah. And keep in mind too, Andrea, that this jury did not get to see some of the more, I guess, standout moments from inside the courtroom. Like I call back to last week when Lori Vallow Daybell got kicked out of the courtroom because she was arguing with the judge. The jury wasn't present for that. So some of her more argumentative moments, I would imagine, if they are now, if they are curious jurors, and maybe some of them have no interest. They're like, I've done my duty. I am done with this. I never want, I don't care to know anymore. But, I would imagine if they're researching this, some of that is going to come up and they're going to be like, oh my goodness, this was the same trial that we just sat in, because so much happened outside of their presence, which just brings back the perspective of Tosh, who we were able to speak with very briefly because Brandon Boudreau and his family were coming out, but we did catch up with Tosh after the verdict was read today. So take a listen.
You were on the jury last time, but now watching this trial, being here today, what brought you here? Kind of walk us through your thoughts.
I wanted to see what it was like to be on the opposite side. It felt a lot better being on this side, being able to support the family again. And I knew what it was like. Nobody in the crowd knew but me what it was like to what they were going through right now, So being able to feel what they felt, not knowing anything, was pretty cool.
They'll probably go home and get kind of that information done
Yeah.
that you did. What's your advice to them taking it all in?
It's a lot. So just let it, before they watch it, kind of let themselves sink in to what just all happened. Because when I watched it right after, it was a lot. It was still intense.
So talking, I think if you couldn't hear that reporter's question, a little bit difficult to hear, but asking kind of what would your advice be to the jurors that just went through the exact same process that you did just 2 months ago. And so saying, let all that just happened and all that you just went through sink in, maybe before you start diving into her history, because as they said, it's a lot, right? It is a lot. And I can imagine, as you read more, of course, we've seen it play out, over months, years. To get it all at once is a lot. And of course, you and I know that when you start to talk to people maybe that aren't as familiar about this case, they ask you, what case you're covering, or ask you what inside the courtroom is all about, and you start to kind of piece together the story. It's not an easy one to tell. It's certainly not one that is
No.
succinct. It is incredibly complex and complicated, and lots of different people in different angles. And so I can understand that statement of it's a lot. That would be an understatement.
Yeah.
And so but they know exactly. They have a lot of insight into what they're likely experiencing tonight.
Yeah. And, I'll say, Andrea, I know we've been covering these cases for 5+ years, and yeah, it's so hard to be fluent in everything that's happened and even remember that. So I can't imagine being someone who has no knowledge and then, sit in through these very specific proceedings, knowing that there are gaps in the story, and then having to, when you get the opportunity to fill in the gaps, realize that there are gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of information that you thought there may have been just a few small holes, but it's so much. So if any juror is watching this, we'd love to hear from your perspective. If you are willing to come forward and talk with us, we'd love to hear what it took to get to that verdict today. And unfortunately, we didn't get more time to talk with Tosh because, as you may have heard, again, a little hard to hear under the main person speaking, but there was applause. And we all turned and we saw Brandon Boudreaux and his family coming out. So there were people in the courtroom that I saw, Andrea, who have come every single day. Some people I've recognized from the cases in Idaho, from cases, from the prior trial here in Arizona. So there have been, not as big a group as we've seen before, because we knew today was going to be, well, we didn't know it was going to be short, but we knew once a verdict is read, the proceedings are typically short. You hear it, there's maybe some discussion, which we'll get into in a moment, but it was, these people waited outside in triple-digit temperatures to wait for Brandon Boudreaux to come outside and give him that round of applause, which I think just, again, speaks to just how impactful he was as a living witness to put Lori Vallow in this position to be convicted again.
Well, and as you said yesterday, we know that even though the gallery may not have been quite as full as we have seen in previous cases, we also know that everyone in that gallery is either covering it as a journalist or, is someone who has interest in this case, and we have not seen any supporters of Lori Vallow Daybell. So, anyone gathered there has put their support behind the Woodcocks and the Boudreaux and Colby Ryan. And so, always in support of the victims. And so that isn't always the case in every trial. Of course, we know that there are plenty of defendants who do have supporters. And we have, talked about the other cases across the country where you see, a significant split of opinion in what should happen and, what should be believed. In this case, we don't have that. And so that is also remarkable because probably everybody gathered there seems to support the prosecution and seems to support the victims in this case.
Absolutely. And, there are a few other people in that courtroom. I know we just talked about the gallery, but Vallow Daybell represented herself, but she had some people at her table, and these were her advisory council. They were supposed to be her public defenders if she was not representing herself. And there was a point throughout this trial where, again, Lori Vallow Daybell had to be reminded time and time again, don't do things this way, don't do that, don't do this. We mentioned she got kicked out. She kept trying to open the door to bring in, testimony that she shouldn't have been bringing in, things that could have opened the door for the prosecutor to bring in her prior convictions, which they were trying very hard not to do as not to taint this case in any way. And the judge at one point said, I believe this was after she had been removed and came back and said, I apologize, I am here.
Yes.
And the judge said, I could revoke your pro se status here, meaning you would no longer be allowed to represent yourself. So we've had these two people sitting with her, Pam Hicks and Robert Abernathy, and we've seen them throughout the trial. And I know this has been a question from you, Andrea, about, is she getting any advice from them? Is she taking any advice from them? Of course, we can't zoom in and listen and hear their conversations, but she was pretty, each and every day we saw her either turn around or look to her, left and chat with them about a variety of different things, especially when she was going up to do cross-examination or just listening, feverishly writing in her legal pad. But they have not commented, and that remained the case after court today. We were able to actually catch them on their way out of the courthouse. So take a look and see how this unfolded.
We asked about
What was it like working with Lori?
Can you comment on working with Lori?
No, we can't comment.
and we don't want to comment. Thank you.
Any reaction to the verdicts, both of them? Verdict you guys anticipated?
Glad it's over, Robert.
Is she planning to work on any sort of appeal?
We don't have enough to say.
Yeah, no comment. They said they didn't want to comment, wouldn't comment, can't comment, all of the above. I also, you asked about I think it was you who asked about the appeal. I've had that question as well about how much these advisors have played into, or how much input they have had into her motions for recusing the judge, which, multiple different filings to try to get Judge Boreski off of the case, filing additional, appeals to try to get the judge who said, no, we're not going to remove him, some sanctions against that judge. And so there have been multiple appeals here, and even her motions in the last case, to appeal the what we talked about earlier about those jurors and the things that they said after the trial. So I'm always wondering about how much input these two advisors, these two public defenders, have had in those as well, because some of those, it's difficult to know how much. And I know, as she said in her closing statement, that she has studied the law. One could argue that her demonstrations in court did not appear to match what we know about, about the performance of people who have studied the law and know the law and follow the law. But nonetheless, she has filed these motions.
It's a very delicate way to say it, Andrea.
Right? Thank you very much. One could wonder, well, how much input they have had in some of these motions, and do they encourage an appeal, or do they just wait for her to say, help me write an appeal? I am interested in how much input they have as her advisory team, and I'm not sure if they will answer that question or if there's a way to even know that, but it is a question that still remains in my mind.
And I think it's a very good and fair question, because we saw these people sitting with her day in, day out. On one day, we understood one of them had a child care issue and was not able to come in. This was pre-planned. But then the other advisory counsel came in late, and the judge was mad about it. He said, this is unacceptable, and essentially told her, you're representing yourself. You don't need these people. So I don't know how much she took from them. They obviously were there. They were assigned to be there. We heard her in, I believe it may have been some sort of pretrial hearing, where she said, I didn't ask for them to be assigned to me, but it also seemed like she did rely on them, at least to give her some insights. Again, we do not know if they were telling her one thing and then out came another, but I don't know. And I will say, when we learned that she was going to represent herself, that's when we first started seeing a slew of different motions. And these were not her first public defenders assigned to her. She had, there were a few iterations of that. And one even tried to file, for competency to see if she was competent. Yes. And, that was an issue that we saw in Idaho. So it does make you wonder if, what goes on in her mind and how she feels about her ability to represent herself. But I don't know. I think that would be a great question. I hope that one day we can talk to them. They said they could not comment. So I wonder if they have to wait until the sentencing, which we have more details about now, Andrea.
Yeah, well, and I also wonder if, just the idea of, I wonder also if they are just as exasperated or as frustrated. I mean, perhaps their interactions with her are very similar to what we saw played out in court. Perhaps they are giving her advice. Perhaps they're giving her those warnings, much like we saw the judge give, much like the, objections from the prosecutor. Maybe they are also telling her the very same things, only to have her walk out and do and say things against their advice. That could also be very much a possibility. And so, eventually, as you said, maybe after the sentencing, because they will still be part of this case. And I could imagine, they are in a very similar role to the prosecutor, obviously on, if you want to look at it as different sides, but they have a responsibility. They are all bound by bar rules, rules of conduct in the court. They have to be very careful about those. Attorneys take that very seriously. And so, likely when they say they can't talk, those are the kinds of things they're talking about. And so whether or not we ever hear anything from them remains to be seen. Of course, it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't, but those are still questions that I wish that we had answers to.
Yeah. And, circling back just a moment, Andrea, before we get into the sentencing, I want to bring, circle it back to the appeals, because we know this week we got the official documents that Vallow Daybell has filed an appeal in Idaho. And again, we didn't get an answer to that question when I asked them. We haven't been able to ask Vallow Daybell herself. I did put in yet another request to talk to her. Now that we have a verdict in this case, we will see what she decides to do. Again, her right to refuse or decline or accept an interview.
Sure.
That's, she's given a couple so far, but I would very much want to have the opportunity to talk to her, because we do have a lot of questions. But when it comes to appealing, we know she's filed in Idaho, and we've seen her try to push back against the judge, against the court, against these cases. It feels like at every turn of the way here.
Sure.
So I would imagine, and I heard it in the courtroom for both her last trial here in Arizona and this one, where she'll make note and say, I want to flag that for appellate purposes. So it sounds like she, regardless of the outcome, this was before the verdict was read today, regardless of the outcome, she's already thinking about, how am I going to appeal this? Because as we heard in her closing arguments, she feels like she is the one who has been wronged here, no matter the outcome.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we've heard that from, the judge has been biased against her. The judge has not ruled anything in her favor. Again, being essentially arguing that she's been targeted or unfairly, treated unfairly in the courtroom. She talked about that in her opening statement, that, she certainly brings that up, saying, I'm the only one who's charged in this. There's all these co-conspirators. We know that Alex isn't able to be charged because he passed away, but there are others. One of them being her current husband, and this niece that she says was like a daughter to her. But doesn't this also just go to everything else we've seen about her, which is such a contradiction? It isn't really logical or rational to think that she's going to want to put them out in court, and kind of blame them, which she even said, I'm not doing. I'm not suggesting that they're responsible. And then at the same time saying, well, why aren't you charging them? Why just me? And so there's this constant contradiction, I think, in everything that she says. And so it's just one more of them, really.
Yeah. And, as for what's next for her, we have details now about the sentencings here in Arizona. We know she's going to be sentenced for both of her criminal cases, murder or conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the death of Charles Vallow, her fourth and former husband, and then now conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the shooting attempt at Brandon Boudreaux. And in Arizona, that charge carries 25 to life. However, we know that whatever sentence she is given here, she will be going back to Idaho. And we know now that the sentencing at this point is scheduled for July 25th. And in the courtroom today, I'll point out that there's an aggravating phase here in Arizona that could come. And Vallow Daybell, we saw this in her last case, just to give everyone the run through after the verdict was read and after the jury had been released. She essentially stipulated saying this was dangerous. There was, a co-conspirator here. So she didn't want to bring them back in and have them hear about her prior convictions, essentially, from the jury or from the prosecutor, excuse me. And then she asked, they discussed sentencing, and prosecutor Trina Kay is going back and talking to the different victims who plan to speak out. We're expecting they have a block for 3 hours for this sentencing. So we are expecting to hear from people impacted. But then Vallow Daybell pipes up and said, well, doesn't it need to be within 30 days? And the reason Judge Boreski picked the 25th of July, he originally said, sometime a little after that, is because they need that courtroom because it's so large. His typical courtroom is much smaller. They've moved this. So he said, according to our scheduling, this is the first available day we can do this. So that's the plan as of right now. And Andrea, let me tell you, I have been in Judge Boreski's courtroom before for sentencings. And given his relationship, I shouldn't say relationship, but given all the back and forth that the history would probably be a better word. The history now between him and Lori Vallow Daybell. I'm very interested to see what he may say, because I've seen him in other sentencings be, very straightforward, and he's not afraid to tell it how it is. So I'm, again, very, very interested to see what he'll have to say now that this is all coming to a conclusion.
Well, and I wonder, those little glimpses, and he has been, absolutely, patience is an understatement. He has been incredibly, direct at all times, but very calm, very patient. He has certainly, drawn lines and said, do not cross this line. I mean it. But there have been those little tiny moments. And in fact, one of them was during this trial when he talked about opening a door and, being careful. If you're going to speak about character, remember the prosecution can bring up things. And I think the quote was, like your 4 previous murder convictions, and kind of in a, you hear me, right? And so that, I have to think that that's, that certainly is on his mind. And I would guess that we will hear a little bit more about how he feels about that and the responsibility that he feels he has, given the egregious nature of her and the totality of her crimes, because he does get to take that into consideration when it comes to sentencing and looking at, likely to reoffend. Now, we know the likelihood to reoffend is not great because she will be in prison here in Idaho for the rest of her life. However, that's how a judge makes a sentencing. Those are the things that he, one of the things that he considers. And so, it will be very interesting to hear what he has to say, because I would bet he has some thoughts.
Absolutely. And Andrea, I'll say the matter of extradition also came up. As you said, Arizona is not her last stop here. She's going back to Idaho and seemingly will never leave there ever again. She asked about that. She seemed to be of the belief that they would be coming to get her, and maybe there was a 30-day limit to when that would happen. Okay. Judge Boreski actually, said, okay, who do I need to talk to, and what language do I need to put out some orders? So it sounds like there's some, there's going to be maybe something's written or some sort of document that we can get the details of how she's going to be extradited back to Idaho. Okay. But again, we have it'll be maybe about 5-ish weeks until that sentencing date. So she will still be here at the Estrella jail, which is the jail where people who are unsentenced are in Arizona. That's in Maricopa County. It's for women. And we understand that she's been in a cell 23 hours a day. She says she's been in an isolated situation. So those have been her conditions for the past couple of years. And Andrea, I'm wondering if you know anything about the facility that we know she was booked in there briefly before she was brought down to Arizona. What do you know about the facility where she's going to be spending the rest of her life?
Yeah, so it's the women's prison. It's in Pocatello. It's east of Boise. It is a facility where the only woman on Idaho's death row also still in that facility. And so this is the prison, the highest security prison in Idaho for female inmates. She will, likely be secluded, isolated, given the nature of her crimes, both, for her protection, for the integrity of her sentence. And so that's usually what will happen. I did tour that facility not too long ago, earlier this year. She was not there. She was already in Arizona. So I wasn't able to see the exact housing unit or her exact, I wasn't able to see exactly what area she would be in. But most of the women in the highest security areas are essentially isolated and only out and able to come out of that cell for a short time each day. And of course, maintaining all of those standards, but for her protection and for, because of the nature of her crimes, that's likely where she will be. And that's what we usually see with people who have harmed children, have been convicted in these crimes, that they know that other inmates are not sympathetic to at all. So that's where she will be in Pocatello, Idaho. When you talk about the sentencing, Brandon Boudreaux, he will have an opportunity to speak. Does Arizona allow for that kind of what they call victim impact statements? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And so who else? Is there anyone else?
Well, we may not know until the state puts out a file, but if I had to guess, I would imagine Brandon would be speaking. Again, we are sitting in the courtroom as this is as they're trying to schedule this. And Trina Kay, the prosecutor, was she advised the judge that people would be speaking. She said they wanted at least a few hours. And I believe what he wound up slotting was 9 to noon local time here in Arizona, again, at the end of July. And she kept going back and forth to both Brandon and then Kay Woodcock, who was in the room today. Colby was not in the room for the verdict, interestingly, but he showed up. I don't know, or maybe he was somewhere nearby. I don't know, but he did show up and stand, as Brandon said, united. They are united. But I don't know if I would have to look into that, because I know sometimes there are limitations. If you are not like
Right.
the direct
Yes.
victim of a crime, you may
Right.
not be able to say things. But I know people can also send letters of support. There could be
Yes.
different things that are read. So
Sure.
I think there will be a variety of opportunities for people to speak out. And I would imagine, again, as the state has indicated, if they're planning to have multiple people talk, then it should be
Right.
pretty impactful to hear from the people affected by this
Yeah.
case. And, I don't know, when I think to Vallow Daybell's demeanor in all of this today,
Yeah.
just sitting there for the verdict as if she expected it, no expressionless, I would say, just kind of sitting back. And then after being like, okay, I stipulate to, the aggravating factors. And when am I going back to Idaho was kind of her attitude, it felt like.
Right.
And, she's going to be sitting in the room before she's sentenced in these cases and have to hear these people talk about how they've been impacted by her actions. And we've seen her sit and do this in Idaho when she was convicted and sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison there. And I don't know if do you think those victim statements get through to her? What do you think, it might be going through her mind as she's hearing those, Andrea?
Well, I mean, it's so difficult to know. And as I've said on this show, I certainly, if I could get inside her head and understand, how much of this she truly believes or how much she just wants us to believe, if I could answer that question, it would be, something I'd like to know. But, and remembering too, if you think about that, this is a combined sentencing. So, the people impacted directly by Charles Vallow's death would be Kay and would be Brandon. And, because we're also including Brandon's case. So all of those will be together. I imagine Colby Ryan may speak because of Charles Vallow's, relationship and that father figure that he was. He might be allowed to speak, to your point. And so, these are people that she has, you mentioned, perhaps she looked at Colby Ryan, in the gallery the other day, maybe smiled in his direction. She has certainly had moments of trying to speak, kindly about him or, motion to him or look at him. But does it really matter? I'm not sure that I understand her enough to know if it does. I certainly can't imagine it's comfortable because she doesn't seem to like to take any responsibility. And so that's likely the impact statement of, explaining the impact that she has had. That's exactly what it's intended to do. And so whether or not that matters to her, that's a whole different story.
And Andrea, before we go here tonight, I just want to circle it back to those victims, the surviving victims who, the ripple effect. And, thinking about, I'll think of Kay Woodcock in particular, because she has been at each and every trial and has had to sit through testimony and talk about all the harm and has spoken out. And it's just been so much. And to think that this is probably the end of the road once we get to this sentencing for some of these people. And I think Brandon Boudreaux, who has been waiting for this day in court, to get to that finality. And again, maybe there's some appeal processes. Who knows if those will be successful or if anything will come of them. But it seems like this is really it. And it's been a long time coming for a lot of these people who've been going through painful experience after painful experience. And it's not lost on me that none of these had to go to trial, especially if she's not going to put on a defense and sit there and just, not be surprised at the jury's verdict. So I just want to, before we go tonight, just keep it, keep the focus on the victims here and how they can move on from this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also just, to remind of that. And also now, as you said, with that finality, with, this being the end, maybe that is the turning of the page, those cliches that we hear about the ability to now move forward because there isn't something sitting out there looming over them, no stress or unknown. Once you have all of those pieces in place and you have that finality, then maybe now all they need to focus on, as Brandon said in his statement today, all I need to do now, and as I process it, I leave more room for healing, more room for joy, more room for hope. And I think that's the best that we can hope for this Vallow family, for the Ryan family, for Colby, and for everybody who loved all of these victims. Even the Daybell children who lost their mother, all of those people that are directly impacted. And there are many impacted by the crimes of Lori Vallow Daybell. But today, that jury finding her guilty in her final what we believe to be her final case in the conspiracy to commit murder against Brandon Boudreaux. So that is what happened today inside the courtroom. We will be back here with you one more time for her sentencing late July. We hope to see you then.